Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Beyond Trauma podcast. I'm excited to continue a little trend in focusing a bit back on yoga and trauma-sensitive yoga, where it all began, and focusing on some people who are doing really great things in the trauma-informed yoga space. So this conversation is with an old friend of mine who I've known for many years, Greg Nardi, and we discuss his evolution with yoga as a practitioner and a teacher, the ways he's begun to think about yoga differently, and the ways that he is bringing yoga to trauma survivors through a couple of organizations that he's a part of, most notably as the South Florida Program Director for Yoga for Change. I know they are starting a 200-hour yoga training, teacher training that might be closed for applications by the time this comes out, but maybe you could sneak a late one in, or I probably shouldn't be encouraging that. You can reach out and look for their next training that you could be a part of. 3.5 Acres, the nonprofit that I formed, has a 20-hour trauma-informed teacher training coming up end of September. That's for folks who already have their initial 200 or 300-hour yoga teacher training certification. So it's kind of an add-on for trauma sensitivity, trauma informed best practices. So this conversation, well, whether you're a yoga teacher or a yoga practitioner or someone who is curious about yoga, identifies as a trauma survivor, thinking about embodiment practices, healing, curious about yoga philosophy, curious about yoga therapy, which I was. I don't know a ton about yoga therapy. Greg really shares a lot. Really shares a lot of his knowledge. And it's really always just a pleasure for me to connect with him. He began his yoga journey in 1996. And he knew immediately that it was something that he was meant to do. It's helped him feel healthy after years of childhood illness, anxiety, and depression. It's given him a sense of meaning and purpose. And he's really dedicated himself to the yoga lifestyle. Greg took 4 separate teacher trainings in the US and Europe between 1997 and 2003. He's taken a dozen extended trips to Mysore, India. He's focused on asana, yoga, history, philosophy, pranayama, meditation, and chanting. And he's a recent graduate of the Kripalu School of Integrative Yoga Therapy, which is super exciting. And I know he's got lots of ideas for where he's going to go with that and his relationship at Kripalu. He was formerly an authorized level 2 Ashtanga teacher. He'll talk about resigning his authorization. And he's really dedicated himself to educating yoga practitioners about power dynamics, about consent-driven, person-centered, and trauma-informed approaches to teaching and practice of yoga. And Greg has always considered yoga to be both a form of individual healing and social healing justice. So he's just incredible. As I mentioned, he is the South Florida Program Director for Yoga for Change, trauma-informed yoga services nonprofit organization. He sits on the board of directors of Chainless Change, a community of recovery offering second chances to those negatively impacted by the criminal legal system. Greg believes in the healing power of yoga for all, and we will make sure that you have all the links to connect to him and the wonderful organizations that he is a part of in the show notes. So here we go. This is a really joyous interview for me. Well, hello, Greg Nardi.
Good morning.
We're matching.
Yeah, that's right.
Now people have to go to the YouTube. We're matching, and as I told you, we should tell people where you are recording from.
Yeah, I'm currently up at Kripalu Yoga Center in the Berkshires in Massachusetts.
You lucky ducky.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
It was my dream. I vision boarded going there. And I was able to do that last year, and to teach a course on trauma-informed practices for survivors and specifically for folks that are like in therapeutic positions.
Amazing.
It
So
was
more to
really
geared towards
beautiful.
professionals.
Yeah, because like most of my trainings are for yoga teachers, but this was more for, folks in healing, therapeutic spaces. There's a lot of, transference and
Yeah.
secondary trauma that can happen, and a lot of survivors that go into healing professions because we want to make meaning and, help
Yeah,
people.
absolutely.
So why are you there, Greg? It's about
Yeah, I
you.
connected with this place about 5 years ago. I had heard about Kripalu for forever, since as long as I've been practicing yoga. I'm originally from New Jersey, so the Northeast kind of knows Kripalu. And I decided to go back to school after 20 some odd years of studying yoga to learn how to be a yoga therapist. So I started the program in 2019. It's
Wow.
a 800-hour program. So I have been coming over the last 5 years, and I just graduated in January. I'm sorry, in
Yay!
July. In July,
Wow.
and I'm here. I stayed on so that I can assist the incoming class.
Oh, that's so exciting. That is so
Yeah.
exciting. So tell me what that program is all about. What does it mean to be a yoga therapist?
That is a great question. And I think it's one of those things that a lot of people struggle with the nuance of it. It really has a methodology. So we're oftentimes working with either groups or individuals. When we work with groups, we tend to work based on a specific condition, like people all kind of dealing with a similar issue might come into a class, let's say, for sleep disturbance, hypertension, different things like that. And so we would tailor a program specifically to meet that condition.
Wow.
Part of yoga therapy is that each individual also gets an assessment. So everybody in that group would also have an individual assessment process. And when working with individuals, of course, the whole group of sessions would be tailored to that individual person and whatever conditions are arising for them.
So you have to learn a lot
So,
about different conditions and
yeah.
what kind of practices would support healing those conditions, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting thing. So we work off of the kosha model, which is a model that comes from the Upanishads, and it sort of recognizes, health as a multi-dimensional, people really are multi-dimensional. There's a lot of different things and areas of health concern. And so we are typically doing an assessment based on the koshas and sort of where are there various health concerns, from physical to energetic to mental, emotional, and even some of the higher cognitive functions like values, judgment, joy, spirituality, those types of things.
Right, and how all those levels work together, like our emotional state impacts our physical, and so you're
Yeah,
looking at the whole person from all those different levels.
that's one of the words that keeps coming up: whole person wellness.
It seems like just what we should be doing as yoga teachers, like from the start.
It, it honestly feels like, yeah, this is, we call it yoga therapy, but this is yoga.
This is
This is
yoga,
yoga.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I love the approach too, just to, because one of the things that yoga therapy really is moving towards is working within integrative medicine. So being part of sort of healthcare teams. And so we try to remain evidence-based as much as we can. But one of the things that differentiates us from, let's say, Western medical doctors or other professions is that we work off of what's called a salutogenic model. So we don't actually diagnose or treat. What we do is based on, a conversation and assessment with the individual. We actually do what's called salutogenesis, which means that we promote the body's natural healing capacity, right? So
Hmm.
like it's a pretty big area of differentiation, in the sense that like we do lifestyle management and, all sorts of things beyond just like sequencing a good asana class, let's say.
Yeah, looking at the whole life. Like I always say, I mean, this is a small way of saying it, but like people come to yoga asana class and they're like, my shoulder hurts or something, and it's like they're wearing a bag on that shoulder all day.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you have to look at like, well, what are you doing all day? Because you're only doing this thing on the yoga mat for like maybe an hour.
Right. And a lot of times, it would be easy to just be like, well, take that bag off, right? Like, but we don't want to also make those kinds of assumptions. That's even kind of prescriptive, right? So we
Mm.
might lead them through inquiry and like, well, how do you feel when you're wearing that bag? And how do you feel when you don't wear that bag? And try switching it to the other shoulder for a few days. And, just kind of keeping the person at the center of the wellness plan
I'm just gonna
and
say it sounds
having,
very person-centered.
of course, and letting them kind of, really own their own journey of healing, which is cool.
Yeah. And people always say like it's hard to make changes and stick to changes. And I think a lot of that does come because the idea of what change and when and how we should make it is coming from other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's
And sometimes
yeah.
we need the support, right? Like we know that a good percentage, I've heard upwards of 60% of the therapeutic, of the healing comes out of the therapeutic relationship. So I don't want to sort of
Mm-hmm.
minimize the importance of that close relationship between a therapist and the client. But at the end of the day, like it's not about the therapist's ideas of what's going on with this client. It's the client's own conclusions.
Absolutely. It's very important, the relationship. And we shouldn't feel that we have to heal alone. Um,
Mm,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
um, I'm curious, do you do any work or talk about trauma at all in the yoga therapy world? I know you do in some of your other roles.
Mm. Yeah. So, yes, definitely. I would say that it could be more. I personally think, again, all yoga should be trauma informed. That's sort of part of the evolution as I've come to understand what trauma informed yoga is. I really do think it's foundational to the practice of yoga. But I think trauma informed yoga is a relatively new field and relatively new area of inquiry, as I'm sure you know. And so I don't find that there's universal agreement in terms of like what people mean when they say trauma informed
Mm.
yoga. So I think that there are great moves to create trauma informed principles and best practices within yoga therapy. But I also don't want to sort of create the impression that like any person who goes to a yoga therapist is going to automatically find trauma informed or that we all are working off the same playbook with regards to what that even means. So, yes, I think that yoga therapists are more likely to try to be trauma informed. I see the thread of it throughout our training program here at Kripalu. And also, I think that it is a field that's in development.
Hmm.
And I know it's going to continue to grow and get, more clarity.
Do we think yoga therapy might ever get covered by medical insurance here in the US? Do you know anything? I know I'm throwing that out you about the politics around it and if that might happen.
I know that that is a goal in terms of like working in integrative medicine. Right now, the most sort of progress is being made through the VA. So the Veterans Association has a whole person wellness model that they now use, which is amazing.
Yeah.
They even recognize the importance of things like, spiritual health and social health, which is incredible. And I think that is largely, I mean, I might be kind of just assuming here, but, we know that one of the biggest health impacts on veterans is suicidality.
Yeah.
And so, being trauma informed and really looking at a whole person is crucial when you're dealing with that type of a health crisis. So to get back to your question, um, it is now part of the VA that yoga therapy is covered for veterans, and the hope is that that eventually moves out into the private sector as well.
Love that. I mean, you always have to prove concept, proof of concept, and then hopefully it does graduate out. And a lot of that work is, I think, in DC where, these policies are being made. I've also seen a change in like the 25 years I've been in the yoga space in employer support. So there's more like employer support for wellness in general. And so, I think there are people doing it from different sides of the
Yeah,
equation.
interesting. I just took a leadership conference. It was like a business leadership conference, and like, I mean, they just kept coming back to burnout over and over and over
Yeah.
again, and talking about the necessity for giving people work-life balance, and and how burnout is a real issue, and that comes down, when it starts costing corporations money, right? Then they start to look for, like, when it becomes more cost effective to care for the employees, then they will do it.
That's right. And they saw that, the mass exodus from many places of business since COVID. And so they're more incentivized to keep people in employment and happy in their employment.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So let's take it back, Greg. So you're here now, you're at Kripalu, you've now become a yoga therapist, and you're bringing in the new school of the new cohort. But I know you, from years back in the Ashtanga world. And how did you get from Ashtanga to yoga therapy? We might need more than an hour, but
Yeah, yeah.
maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you love about yoga, what you loved and maybe still love about Ashtanga,
Yeah.
and just how you've been evolving.
I can give the sort of really quick answer. I don't know how aware your listeners are, but there's a little trigger warning here. The guru, our guru, my guru, Patabi Joyce, it was revealed that he was assaulting students while he was alive. And when that sort of all became public, it shook a lot of us who had a relationship with Patabi Joyce and who were part of that community. And I just recognized in watching the response within our community that, like, it was really important to get some outside perspective. I want I deauthorized myself. I don't know ever know what the right word for that is, but I guess I resigned. And for a very specific reason, in our tradition, to be an authorized teacher, you are not allowed to give teacher training. And so initially, I recognized that there was something systemic in Ashtanga yoga that, even though Patabi Joyce was dead, had enabled the abuse for so many years. And I felt that I wanted to offer teacher trainings that might be able to address power dynamics and consent and spiritual bypassing and things like that, that would enable people to practice yoga in what I hoped would be a safer way, a more person-centered way. And so I knew I needed some outside perspective for that. And so I decided I looked around. I did a lot of different things, trauma-informed training and, all sorts of different things, talked to a lot of different people, and decided to take a yoga therapy course. I originally was going to do 300 hours because that's sort of the minimum that you can do. And I just kind of fell in love with it and kept going one module at a time until I graduated. And in the process, I really feel like I've shifted so far from where I began. But that's sort of the shorter story of, that was the catalyst for me to start exploring yoga therapy from Ashtanga. It was very much to sort of bring a more person-centered approach into the practice of Ashtanga yoga.
So how does it look now for you, like in your own practice and your own teaching and in the people that you seek to share practice with?
Mm-hmm. I do a lot less Ashtanga. I still really enjoy that practice, but I've also learned to really value softness. Part of sort of deconstructing the way that I had been practicing for so many years was really taking a look at what was motivating me to practice. And I did start to get in touch with the fact that a lot of my prior trauma was driving the way that I was practicing. And so I think that, I was pushing myself extremely hard, dealing with a lot of pain, but telling myself that was part of the process. Um, engaging in a lot of spiritual bypassing. And I really consider myself, even as an Ashtanga practitioner, I was pretty self-aware, cared for myself as much as possible, but there was just something in that system that and the culture around the system that I felt interacted with my personal history in a way that made me continually push myself to extremes. And so nowadays, I still practice Ashtanga yoga, but I go much slower. I give self permission to pick and choose sort of sequences from within the series. Use a lot more props than I ever have before. So I've come up with actually a whole methodology called, it's got a 4-step process: assess, plan, apply, feedback. And so based on sort of my self-assessment for the day, I will pick, amongst a variety of variables, how I want to practice Ashtanga yoga. So that might mean fast or slow, that might mean intense or soft, that might be a longer or shorter practice, that might be, sections of a series, but not a whole series. Maybe, taking certain poses out of the series. So I've kind of identified some key variables that I feel, I came into Ashtanga with the impression that it always had to be done like the same way every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so giving myself that permission that, like, there are identifiable variables within the sequence, and you can skillfully adapt the sequences for the individual rather than trying to make yourself go through the sequences as they are every day. So I just flipped it from being a practice-centric approach to a person-centered approach.
I love that. Maybe you can go into a little more depth about like what you're assessing.
Sure. So I use another part of that is something I call yogic models of wellness. So, keeping it yoga, right? It's not just like, oh, well, how do I feel today?
Right.
Because it's always hard to know. Am I pandering to, or am I taking care of myself? Or
Yes.
am I pushing myself? Or, these types of things. Where's a healthy challenge? Where's that line? So yeah, I use things like the koshas. That's one of the models that I use to self-reflect.
Can you break down the koshas for people? Because not everyone that listens to this podcast is really familiar with yoga because we talk about a lot of different healing modalities.
Yeah, sure. So the koshas are a model that comes from the Upanishads, and again, it's sort of identifying a kind of a whole person wellness scale. It's sort of talking about these 5 bodies or these 5 layers of the individual, and they range from very gross to very subtle aspects of who we are. So the Annamaya kosha literally means the sheath made of food, and so that's like our physicality, our physical body. Then is the Pranamaya kosha, the sheath made of prana, and that is, our energetic body, what I oftentimes relate to physiological processes and energy. And then Manomaya kosha the root word is manas, which means mind, and so that's like our psycho-emotional layer of being. There's Vijnana Maya kosha. So jnana means wisdom. So this is sort of like it's the wisdom body. And this is where, I would conceive of this as like the level of values, discernment, sort of higher cognitive uh, functioning. And then there's the Anandamaya kosha. Ananda means bliss. And so it's like a little bit hard to define what that is. But I would kind of associate that with meaning making. And so, am I doing things that I find meaningful? And, what meanings am I able to draw from this approach to life or practice? So those would be sort of the 5 koshas. And it's interesting, like if I decide that I'm going to approach my practice from the level of Anandamaya kosha, for example, meaning making and joy, I'm not going to get so caught up in like the details of whether my asana is perfect, right? Like I'm going to see if I can do this in a way that I find personally meaningful, that's going to give me a connection to self.
Mm.
And of course, all of these things are happening simultaneously, but you can really, it's much more a matter of like emphasis, right?
Yeah.
What are you emphasizing in your practice?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the models I use. I love the 5 elements. I've, and the Ayurvedic models, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. So I kind of use those models, and I really honestly think that you can look at these variables in the practice and decide what to emphasize or de-emphasize, and that's going to make it a more Pitta practice or a Kapha practice or a Vata practice. And so choose your lens, choose your model,
Yeah.
right? And what that does, it just gives you a way to look at, what do I need today? What do I need from this practice? And then when you're deciding what you're going to practice for the day, then you can sort of, again, emphasize or de-emphasize, or kind of tune up or down the dials on different variables of the practice. Which I find it really great. And it sounds very heady right now, but it becomes a very intuitive process over time.
Now, how does that way of approaching your practice differ in how it's coming up against your trauma than the way you were practicing before?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to create such a stark line before and after, right? I think there's just like a sense of permission now,
Mm-hmm.
permissiveness. And so even before, there were times when the way that I was practicing really worked for me. It was just like when it wasn't working for me, I didn't have the skills to know what to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not very trauma informed, right? Like trauma informed involves a lack of agency. And I think because I always felt there was one way that I could practice and it either worked for me or it didn't. And when it didn't, that then somehow led me to believe that there was a deficiency in me, or, some type of cognitive dissonance. Whereas now I can really sort of practice, and I have tools to say like, oh, if this isn't working for me, there's another way. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just always about like, how can I use this practice to be, my best self, to have the strongest relationship to myself. So it's very embodied. It's very, self-nurturing, and there's a lot more agency involved.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a certain thing when there was so strict of a system that if it wasn't working for you, it was like you were wrong. You were doing it wrong, or you weren't trying hard enough, or you just have to stick with it. Like, just stick with it and like it will like get better, which can sometimes happen. But sometimes it's not happening for a long time. And it's like, do I have to put myself through something that's not working? Like, for how long, And I
Apparently
think,
20 years, apparently.
I mean, for me, it all became, more just apparent when I became a parent through COVID, through aging, through becoming a parent, that things really need to change.
Yeah, and I think you said something really key there, this idea that like it will get better, right? Like what are we trying to make better? Like that's the big, and what does better even mean? And oftentimes, the idea is that you will get better at performing asana. That sort of
Mhm.
becomes the default. And yeah, there's an inevitability of, if you practice a lot of something, you're going to be able to perform it better. I was more flexible before. I was, able to do more asanas before. But I don't, like if I really think about like quality of life overall, I would say I'm much, much um, stronger in my practice now.
Mhm.
I think that I've begun to switch. Early on, I got a message, and this is where I come back to the idea of spiritual bypassing. I think early on, I got a message that there was some end game when it
Mhm.
came to yoga. And even though over the years I started to understand that that wasn't 100% true, there was still this program underlying it that if I practice hard enough, long enough, that I'll get somewhere or achieve something or
Yeah.
find some type of permanent state of something, what we might call enlightenment. And I think I've I now look at it as though really we are adaptable creatures by nature. That is like we have a nervous system that is designed to help us adapt to our environment, both internal and external. And so if enlightenment is anything, it's being present to the need to adapt and change and skillfully working with what is rather than,
Hmm.
suppressing things in favor of some hopeful future goal.
Yeah. I mean, I find like some of that same misinformed concept in like in some like of the meditation teaching that's out there. I don't know if you know Sochen, but I've been getting more into that, which is basically like helping you realize like it's right here, right now.
Mm,
And this idea, and of course, this is balance. Like, there's great things about practice, and there's great things about practicing concentration, right? But there is this idea that, like, it's hard and it's a long journey, and you're getting, if you ever get there to this enlightenment, and there's this other way where it's like it's right here. It's actually right
mm, mm.
here, right now.
Yeah, yeah, and you bring up a great point. There are wonderful things that come from concentration, right? It's just like if you only have one tool in your toolbox, you know what I mean? Like if you've only got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, as they
Mhm.
say. So concentration is great when concentration is called for.
Exactly. It's the artfulness. It's really the artfulness of knowing what is being asked for this moment. And that is
Mm,
like life skill, right? And that's in the Gita. Like, this isn't stuff we're putting on to yoga. It's right there.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So I wonder how you see yoga in general, and in the specifics of the way you're teaching it now, as serving like trauma survivors. I know that that's become more of your focus.
It is. So yeah, just a little bit more of my story. I think I always felt that yoga had this sort of revolutionary potential. I came to yoga from a place of real, needing real healing, very dissatisfied with, what I found in the world. I was in my early 20s, at that stage where you're supposed to go out and start adulting. And I was like, this is BS. Like, I just like wasn't into it. So I started looking for, something that was meaningful. And that's kind of how I came across yoga. And, you know, coming from a background of depression and suicidality myself, a lot of anxiety, childhood illness. Um, and so as I started to practice yoga, it really did have this sense that this was, it just changed me in so many positive ways. And I was like, if everybody could do this, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, if everybody could have access to this, it can make a great change. And I think I've sort of watched, as many of us have, this was in the mid 90s. I sort of watched yoga sort of peak, become mainstreamed, and in some ways gatekept and only accessible to a very small part of the world. I think everybody benefits from yoga for sure, and yet some of the people that it seems could really benefit the most don't have access to it for a variety of reasons, not just financial, but maybe they don't feel comfortable in the spaces where yoga is often practiced. And so I started to have like a longing that I wanted to bring yoga. Yeah, I wanted a little bit more of an activist approach to yoga. I wanted to bring yoga into other places. So I sort of closed my studio just as the pandemic was starting, and kind of was trying to figure out what I was going to do. That's why I was going through a lot of soul searching and deciding to become a yoga therapist. And through this process, I've started working in the nonprofit sector I work for an agency called Yoga for Change, which is Florida based, and we teach trauma informed yoga out in the community. We teach four populations primarily. We teach veterans and active military. We teach justice impacted, which could be incarcerated or post carceral, or families of people who are incarcerated. we teach to youth, and we teach in behavioral health settings. That could be substance misuse centers or people going through medical trauma or different things like that. So I feel like I've sort of found a way to bring yoga beyond the studio, which I find very fulfilling. And it only makes sense that you have to teach trauma informed yoga in that context. Number one, we're going into populations that are specifically oftentimes have high instances of trauma. And this is the thing that I most love about it is like they may or may not want to be in your class. Right? Like when you go into a yoga studio, you pretty much assume that people are there because they want to be there, unless maybe they were dragged there by a partner or a parent or something. But this is sometimes people are court mandated into our classes, like if they're incarcerated, like they might have to be there. And they might be at a really low part in their life. And so when you actually see a good benefit from the yoga, it's genuine, like, that feedback is as real as it's going to get.
Yeah.
And to me, that's, I think, where I'd like to see yoga start to head, and why I think trauma informed yoga is so important, because I think it's now starting to be integrated throughout organizations, hospitals, institutions, and that has a much broader application, I think, than what we may find in a lot of yoga studios.
Aside from being more person-centered, what would you say are the defining characteristics of what makes a yoga practice trauma-informed versus what people might imagine or have experienced in the studio?
Yeah. So I personally identify sort of two trajectories for trauma informed yoga that I've been able to identify. So oftentimes we think of it in a clinical sense, right? So trauma is a very specific diagnosis. It's a cluster of symptoms. It comes from a nervous system that has been overwhelmed and not able to process an event or series of events. And so trauma informed yoga, yoga has been shown to sort of support people in dealing with some of the symptoms associated with trauma. So things like disembodiment or dissociation, the inability to stay present, hypervigilance, flashbacks. So there's a lot of these kind of symptoms that yoga practices like mindfulness, breath, and postural practice can really help people who are struggling with those things. And it might be used in a specific clinical setting for somebody who is actively dealing with that. The second strand that I sort of identify, I might more properly term trauma awareness. And so this is sort of the idea that trauma is really ubiquitous. It's so much more prevalent than we think.
Mm-hmm.
People do not like to identify with their trauma, and so I, for myself, like, I never would have said I'm walking around with trauma, but certainly things from my past were impacting my behavior in negative ways, and I had to kind of learn skills and change some of my behaviors to help me find more healthy orientation towards life. And so thinking about teaching just a public yoga class, you can assume that there's a good number of people in that class who are dealing with some level of trauma. And so teaching what I call, or what might be called best practices. So how do we conduct a class in a way that makes people who may be dealing with trauma feel more agency, feel more supported, feel that they're in a safer space. We can't guarantee safety. Safety is a felt sense from the individual, not something we can ever say is a safe space, but how can we create a space where somebody might feel more safety? And so I would say that those are sort of two sort of branches of trauma-informed yoga that need equal development.
Yeah.
All yoga teachers, I think, should get some basis in trauma awareness.
Say it again for the people in the back.
Yeah, for sure, for
Screaming
sure.
that.
And also, there's something that can be done. Like if I'm teaching a yoga therapy client, we may or may not do asana at all, right? If I'm trying to teach embodiment, or that's something we decide we want to work on in a session, that might be as simple as like just touching your own body and naming your body parts as you touch them, right? Like literally knowing that you have a body and building a connection to it. And doing an intense asana practice is likely not going to be what's called for in those circumstances.
When you're working with populations where there has been trauma and folks are likely in an active trauma response, maybe with some of those symptoms you described, like hypervigilance, are there specific postures that you think are recommended, or is it more of the approach?
It's more like there are specific things that we would not do
Hmm.
in terms of shapes. So that's one thing. For example, even calling it posture or pose.
Yeah.
So language is a big thing, but like, for example, if we're dealing with sexual assault survivors or sexual trauma survivors, you want to be really careful about using words like pose or posture, because they may have been in a position to have to pose for an abuser or things
Yeah.
like that. And so we typically say shapes, let's make this shape, let's make that shape, or even just, describing what we're going to do together without naming the shape at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, you want to think about what, there's this word triggers that seems to be arising into sort of the vernacular. And this is this idea that there are certain things that can cause a re-experiencing of some type of prior trauma. And that might look like a flashback or a remembering of the event, but it might not. It just might feel like frustration, anger, depression, freezing responses. So it's, when we talk about trigger, it's really like we're having a response to a situation that is maladaptive.
Hmm.
And so we can't always know what's going to trigger everybody. But what we can sort of do is working in certain populations, knowing that there might be common experiences, we would avoid things that could potentially be triggering. Um, in carceral populations, for example, we don't put the hands up over the head or have people bind their hands behind their back,
Mm.
because that might be a trigger of a arrest experience. Yeah, so there are considerations like that. If it comes to what would we do in terms of postural to build a sense of embodiment, like I said, it's real. You're working with proprioceptive techniques, and so you want to do things. It's not really so much the particular shape you make, but maybe how you do it. So you want to do it in a way that's slow and controlled, so that the person can actually, feel what's happening in their body. You don't want to sort of get into like, oh, we're just trying to execute this movement. You want
Yeah.
to actually try to feel the full path of movement, and these types of things.
Yeah. Some really good points there. If someone's listening and they don't yet practice yoga, but
Mhm.
they feel like they've been through some stuff and they feel like maybe yoga might be a path for them, what do you recommend? Like, where should they start?
So you might check into organizations like yours and mine that specifically offer trauma informed yoga. I know that we offer community classes at different nonprofit centers around Florida. We also offer some online resources, um, that are specifically trauma informed. So that's what I would be looking for if I were sort of interested in this type of work, is something that specifically identifies itself as trauma informed yoga.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you go into a yoga class, you just don't really know what you're going to get yet. That's why we're saying like every yoga teacher should have some trauma sensitivity training, at least to have some basics around a safer space. Not that you're necessarily going to be as strict with like what you're doing and not doing as if you were really specifically serving trauma survivors, but knowing that in any shared space, survivors are in there. Folks who have been through trauma are in there. What about for basics? Let's say, for someone who's listening, who's a yoga teacher, they don't want to cause harm.
Mm.
They haven't done a full trauma informed yoga teacher training, which they should do through one of our organizations. But they don't want to hurt anyone. What are some basics?
Yeah. So one of the things I really like, I think SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Government
Yes.
Association, they put out some guidelines of what's called trauma-informed care. And that's something that is typically for mental health professionals or medical professionals. And I draw a lot on those principles. There's 8 pillars of trauma-informed care. But one of the quotes I remember from that website, which really changed a lot of the way that I approach this work, they said, trauma informed care is a movement away from asking what's wrong with this person to asking what's happened to this person.
Oh yeah.
And I really love that. So you allow somebody, instead of seeing somebody as a problem, you see somebody and you see their whole history and you recognize their humanity, in dealing with them. And that I feel is a
Mm,
guiding principle, in terms of being able to offer trauma informed yoga, keeping the person at the center of it, offering a lot of choice. So again, as yoga teachers, and if I go back to sort of a former self and way of teaching, it was like my job as a teacher is to be able to get people to do certain movements or make certain shapes with their bodies. And that's what I thought made me a good teacher, was the
yeah.
ability to get people to do these things. And sort of really, really letting go of that and asking, giving people choices, options, really just restoring that sense of agency in the clients. Don't use hierarchical language. Sometimes it sneaks in so many subtle ways.
Yeah.
Even when oh yeah, you can use props, but if you're not modeling the use of props or you're not normalizing the use of props, like,
Yeah.
are you really creating a space where people feel comfortable to use props? Those
It's
types
like
of things.
having it there versus like someone has to like creep across the room and grab this thing that they need. It's all those, you know, and words like let's modify versus like,
Here's some variations.
yeah,
Yeah.
here's some different variations. I always say like, I'm going to do this one, like, and it's usually like a gentler version, right? I might say like, if you feel like you want a more intensity, you can go for this, but kind of because we're so generally as, Americans, we're very intense enough. So we need
Mhm.
more permission to back off.
That's 100% the case. Like, we come to our yoga like we come to everything else. We don't come to yoga as a separate space. We bring all of our conditioning into it. And so if you've been through the school system, if you've lived in this economic system, if you've worked in this economy,
Yeah.
you are used to striving towards a, consistent progress towards a goal.
Yeah.
And that's not always what yoga is, right? So 100%, if you're the teacher in the front of the room that is always demonstrating the most advanced version, or even that word advanced is
Yeah.
tricky, right? But the most complex version or the hardest version that you can do, what is the message that you're giving to the class,
Yeah.
right? Like, that is the thing about power dynamics in a classroom. There's a bunch of students and you're the only one teacher, and so you have an outsized influence over what's happening in that class.
Yes.
And people will model their behavior after yours, so start with yourself.
Yes. And as you said, I thought was, really on point is like we've been conditioned, since very young age, preschool, right, to do what the teacher says and to want to please. And it takes a lot to unconditioned. So as much as you might want to feel like I'm a teacher offering a lot, people are still going to be looking for what they think you want from them. So it's a lot of internal work that we have to do
Mm,
around what yoga really is and what we're
yeah.
valuing in the class. I always say that I'm excited when I see lots of people doing lots of different things because I know that
Hmm.
they're all listening to themselves.
Yeah. And, like as an Ashtanga teacher, because I'm sure, we know each other from that community, and I'm sure there will be some listeners on this podcast from that community, like it doesn't mean that we can't all be doing a practice that we share. We can all be working off of the same kind of template,
Hmm.
but we can all do it in our own way.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've encountered this where I start talking about the ability to have agency and make choices around your practice, and people just think like, "Well, won't it just be chaos?"
Hmm.
Like it's almost like you can't even conceive of how can you have a class with agency, and it's I just take it from me, it's possible. Like you said, when you look around and yeah, maybe everybody's doing a similar practice and similar poses, but they're doing it in their own unique way that serves them that day.
Yeah. Yes. There's still structure there. And in fact, we can't really experience freedom without some structure. So that actually helps people, especially folks who have had trauma. Too much choice can be overwhelming. So, we
Mhm.
know that there is some structure within that. I don't want to get too pose focused. I was thinking um some of the other aspects of yoga philosophy, and some of the other things that yoga teaches us. I'm wondering if you can speak to some of those and how they can help us deal with trauma. Like, I'm thinking of meaning making. I'm thinking of like observer mindset, the way that um, we can go through that we can watch emotions. Anything that you want to speak to about like those parts of yoga?
Yeah. Yoga philosophy has been near and dear to me. I've studied it quite a lot, mostly because I knew that yoga was very powerful. The techniques of yoga that I was doing, asana practice, breathing practice, meditation practice, I was changing my diet, spending time in nature, and it was having this really great benefit, but I had no idea how it worked. And so I felt that the answers might lie in yoga philosophy. And so I did a deep dive um, into yoga philosophy over many years. And um, it's it brings up more questions than answers, which I think is what it's meant to do. Um, I think I've encountered a philosophy teacher that I am quite taken with their work. This is Dr. Sham Ranganathan, who I think you have also come across. Did you
Mhm.
interview him?
No, we did like a joint thing,
Okay.
all of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's right. That's right. We were on the panel together. And it answered working with him has answered a lot of really important questions for me, and I don't mean that like, oh, he said something and I now believe what he said. um, I had come across certain questions in yoga philosophy for a long time that just didn't sit right with me,
Mm.
and the way that I was able to answer that by studying the work of different Indologists, different academics, and different pundits and priests in Mysore, was sort of like constructing this narrative about the shifting history and, the various sort of socio-cultural and political influences on yoga that have caused it to change. And therefore, there wasn't really a cohesive philosophy. There was more of a dialogue that was happening in South Asia. And I still think that is true to some degree. But unfortunately, that has led a lot of Indologists to the conclusion that a text such as the Yoga Sutras, which is probably what I dive deepest into, is an incoherent text. There's a couple of different sort of philosophies around that. One is that this is sort of a Iron Age text for renunciates and really isn't appropriate for modern times unless we interpret it for the modern era, which is what a lot of modern translations do. Or Another sort of more academic conclusion has been like there have been multiple authors and there have been like later interpolations into the text, and so it's really not a coherent philosophical system. One of the things that always bothered me is that through this, and this is, if this is getting too technical or we're going in a direction, let me know. There's this idea that yoga always has to be read through the lens of Sankhya philosophy. Sankhya is another philosophical system that is oftentimes considered to be like the partner philosophical system to yoga. So Sankhya is sort of a metaphysical system. It's talking about sort of ontology, all the things that are said to exist at various levels, from very subtle to very physical. And so yoga is always seen as the practical part of how do we realize the insights that are given to us in Sankhya philosophy. And in Sankhya philosophy, there's something very sort of clearly stated, which says that the essential self, what they call the Purusha, is purely a witness. Purely a witness, has no agency, has no volition, right? As a matter of fact, they consider volition part of nature, part of Prakriti. And it always occurred to me then, if my essential self basically has no volition, has no will, how could I even get the project of yoga off the ground? Like, how can I take any action on my own behalf? It seems very kind of deterministic in that sense. And so working with Dr. Ranganathan, what he did is he uses a different methodology of translation. He says that most of the time when translations are done, it's done through something called interpretation, where we read a text, we look at the different meanings of a word, and then we think, well, what does that mean to me? Or which words, because Sanskrit is a polyvalent language, so you can get a lot of meanings out of a single word. And so you kind of pick and choose which meanings resonate and fit kind of your preconceived notions or your preconceived biases, which is really the opposite of what yoga is. So using a different methodology, what he calls explication, he did a translation, and in that, all of a sudden, you see that the Purusha has volition everywhere. And so what that has done for me is it has helped me understand that really this word kaivalya, this idea of enlightenment, what's often called isolation, I think of this now as autonomy. Right? So this is the goal of yoga. This is the goal of yoga, is that I can act in a way where I'm no longer just kind of dealing with the circumstances that are pressing in on me, but I actually can make volitional choices. I can take agency to act in the world in a way that is ultimately going to be, involve self-care and harmony and these types of things. So that's how I don't think that yoga philosophy helps us practice yoga. I think yoga philosophy is yoga. All of the techniques and practices are bringing us towards this place where we are free from the influence of our past, from the influence of our conditioning. It doesn't mean it's not there, right? But it means that there's this hopefulness that if I continue to practice things, that I can increase my agency. And I say it that particular way, increase my agency, because it is a practice, right? It's not something that ever, okay, I get there and now I never have to worry about this again, right? Like, you have to continually practice agency. You have to continually be self-studying to know when is your past and when are outside influences sort of creating thoughts in your mind that are not really serving you in this moment, right? So you're constantly having to do the work of agency.
I love that. That was so powerful. And that draws such a clear line between this practice and moving forward from our past, and not being owned by it, and not harming others, right? Because really we often harm others because our past is running us. So
Yeah. That's yeah, and I think that you bring up, like the cornerstone of that is ahimsa, right? This idea of nonviolence, and this is another thing with nonviolence. If we think of autonomy as sort of like the ideal of yoga, then nonviolence is no longer just a matter of like being nice to people, or not. I mean, we all find ourselves in weird ethical dilemmas, and like not doing harm is not really possible.
Yeah.
But if we put it in this context, then really the highest form of ahimsa is allowing others to have their agency as well. Right? So it's not about, like, and we all do things that are sometimes causing harm, but are we infringing upon each other's agency, and can we be sort of respectful that everybody has their own process and their own history that they're working their way out of?
Oh, that's something to sit with today, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Greg, I've taken up quite a bit of your time. I know you're at Kripalu, and I want you to enjoy it. As we're wrapping up this hour, can you share with folks what's coming up for you, what's on the horizon for you? What are you working on? How people can find you and work with you?
Sure. Yeah, it's. I have to say, I'm not doing as much public work, but the agency I work for is called Yoga for Change. We are starting a 200-hour teacher training in the fall. It starts in October, so we're taking applications right now. That's www.y the number 4c.org. And so if you're interested in that, I'll be involved there. I also offer yoga philosophy sessions as part of different teacher trainings. So you might catch me at a teacher training somewhere. And if you wanted to kind of just catch a personal connection with me, you can check me out on Instagram at Greg Nardi. I keep it simple. Feel free to send a DM or anything like that. And if you're interested in working with me, I do some classes. I live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Very minimal classes, and I do some private lessons as well.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any final words you want to leave us with, or anything that we didn't hit on today that's important that you want to make sure to share with listeners?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. I would just say, um, yeah, I think that it's just really important that we start to, in the current climate, social, cultural, political, and environmental climate. I think it becomes really important that we consider the ways in which our yoga practices are engaged practices, in the ways that they, again, allow a part of having agency means being able to be involved in the world. I know we are at a time where there's so much going on that it's very easy to become apathetic and feel hopeless. And I think our practices can really, really, really serve us in giving us that sense that, like, we actually can make a difference. We can have a voice in dealing with our world. So
Let's leave them with that.
sounds good.
Find your way to get engaged and to be in
Thank
this
you, Lara.
world. Thank you so much,
It's
Greg. Enjoy your time.
really good seeing you.
It's
Yeah.
awesome to see you. Stay on for a minute just so I can catch up, but we'll say bye to our listeners.
All right.